What's the deal with gluten and should you be worried about eating it? In this video, I share what gluten is, how to tell if it is a problem for you, and how to avoid it if you need to. Gluten is a protein found in certain types of grains, mainly wheat, barley, and rye. It has a stickiness to it, which is likely how it got its name, which is derived from the Latin word for glue. This sticky nature is also what makes it appealing because it helps bread dough rise and hold together, and it makes cookies soft and chewy. Without gluten, bread is dense and cookies crumble. And the stickiness also makes gluten a useful food additive because it stabilizes and thickens things, so it's not uncommon to find it in sauces, soups, marinades, and gravies. Now, gluten has gotten a bad reputation, but in and of itself, it's not evil. In a healthy individual, it is actually a protein source, but some people have an intolerance to it. Gluten is a serious problem for people who have been diagnosed with celiac disease. And this is an autoimmune disorder that is estimated to affect about 1% of the population. And the fact that it is an autoimmune disorder means that your immune system mistakenly attacks its own tissues, and in this case, it would be the lining of the small intestine. Because your small intestine is the area where most nutrients are absorbed, celiac disease can result in nutrient deficiencies. And the disorder is triggered by gluten, and your doctor can diagnose it with a blood test or a biopsy of the small intestine. Gluten sensitivity is more common, but there's no clinical test for it. So the estimate of how prevalent it is based on self-reporting of the symptoms. And because of this, the actual percentage of the population that is impacted by gluten sensitivity is hard to determine. To give you an idea, I've found sources that put the estimate anywhere from 6 to 13%. But someone with a gluten sensitivity will experience symptoms when they eat gluten, but they test negative for celiac disease. And as for symptoms, a person with celiac disease may experience a host of them, including fatigue, weight loss, bloating, gas, abdominal or joint pain, nausea, skin rashes, headaches, and diarrhea or constipation. Symptoms of a non-celiac gluten sensitivity are similar, but the person with a sensitivity would not have the damage to the small intestine that is seen in the person with the actual autoimmune disorder. Now, gluten can be a difficult ingredient to avoid because grains are the basis of many popular foods, and gluten is used as a food additive in products that we wouldn't suspect. Foods you need to be aware of when following a gluten-free diet include items that we do think of as bread-like products, including bread itself, dough, pancakes, muffins, cereal, breading on fish or meat, pasta, baked goods, crackers, and pretzels. Less obvious foods that may contain gluten include certain commercial brands of chicken or beef broth, hot dogs and other processed meats, veggie burgers, and certain packaged snacks like roasted nuts and potato chips. Now, nuts and potatoes in their pure form are gluten-free, but they may get contaminated with gluten if they are processed in the same facility as a gluten-containing food. Other foods that may have gluten include condiments and sauces like soy sauce and some salad dressings, as well as prepackaged seasoning and spice mixes. And gluten is also found in beer, malt beverages, which would include varieties of wine coolers and some other flavored alcohol drinks. Now, food manufacturers and food bloggers have come out with products and recipes that make gluten-free versions of many of the foods that I have listed here. And while it's hard to match the chewy, moist texture of foods that contain gluten, these products do offer safe alternatives. If the food is packaged, the label will often identify it as being gluten-free, but if you don't see a gluten-free label, you need to be a bit of a detective. And this requires reading the ingredient list and looking for items that may contain gluten. So look for obvious words like wheat, barley, and rye, but also look for less obvious ingredients that may indicate that there is gluten in the product, like dextrin, maltodextrin, malt vinegar, natural or artificial flavorings, natural colorings, modified food starch, and hydrolyzed protein. Now, earlier I mentioned that celiac disease affects about 1% of the population, and up to 13% of people may be affected by gluten sensitivity. But even if we add those segments of the population together, we see that the majority of people in the world tolerate gluten just fine. So why is gluten on the minds of so many, and is the problem getting worse? Well, there are likely many reasons why we hear so much about gluten these days. Some of the interest can be attributed to awareness, since we have access to health information from so many outlets nowadays. And it may be that this heightened awareness has led to a more common diagnosis of the problem. But there are likely some physical factors that are causing a rise in sensitivity to gluten. Grains are grown differently than they once were. Over the years, they have been genetically modified to make them hardier, which is not always a bad thing, but in this case, it could have altered the gluten content of the grains in ways that we had not intended. And we can't overlook the fact that as a society, we consume more grains than ever before. Remember, gluten is found in foods like bread, pizza dough, cookies, and a whole host of sauces and condiments. So it could be that the increase in gluten consumption is overwhelming our digestive systems, and this could be where the connection to the condition called leaky gut comes into play. If you've heard of leaky gut, you've likely heard it in connection with gluten. Leaky gut is a simple term that literally means that the gut allows potentially harmful substances to leak through it and enter the bloodstream. It does have a more sophisticated name, which is intestinal permeability. But in a healthy gut lining, there are tight junctions between the cells that prevent harmful substances from leaving the intestine. If these tight junctions get damaged, they can leak bacteria and toxins into the blood, causing widespread inflammation. Gluten activates a protein called zonulin that regulates these tight junctions in your intestinal wall. And zonulin can increase the permeability and leaking of these tight junctions, but this might be a problem only for individuals with celiac disease or other intestinal issues like irritable bowel syndrome. In a healthy person, it's questionable how much of an effect gluten has on leaky gut. Yet, it opens the question of whether or not you should avoid gluten. And the answer to that question is simply that some people can tolerate gluten and some cannot. If you have been diagnosed with celiac disease, gluten must be avoided. If you experience discomfort after eating grain-based foods or consuming other foods with gluten, you will likely be gluten sensitive and you will likely feel best on a gluten-free diet. Now, others of us can consume gluten, but foods that are high in gluten are not dieters' friends, and it is possible that overconsumption can set you up for problems down the road. So if health and weight control are factors that you want to improve, gluten-containing foods should be limited. So let's discuss strategies to avoid or limit gluten. Because gluten is in so many foods, eating at restaurants can be challenging for those who are trying to go gluten-free. If you do eat out, you'll do best if you avoid sauces and foods that have been breaded and fried. And gluten is a protein, but since it is a protein found in grains, it is mostly found in high-carb foods. So the best way to avoid gluten is to eat a low-carb diet. Now, while the upper range of a low-carb diet is often defined as 125 grams per day, those who follow a low-carb diet for weight loss may find that they need to keep their carb intake well below 100 grams per day to really see results. If you follow a keto diet, which is a very low-carb diet, your upper limit of carbs is no more than 50 grams. If we consider that 2 slices of sandwich bread contain more than 30 grams of carbs, it's easy to see how a low-carb diet would naturally cut out these and other high-gluten foods. And when you follow a low-carb diet, you include foods that are naturally free of gluten, like meat, poultry, fish, eggs, unflavored dairy foods, raw nuts and seeds, non-starchy vegetables, and low-carb fruits. So a low-carb diet and a gluten-free diet have many parallels, but a gluten-free diet is not necessarily low-carb. High-carb foods that are gluten-free include fruits, starchy vegetables like potatoes and corn, and beans. There are also several gluten-free grains, including quinoa, rice, and oats. But oats tend to be contaminated with gluten when they are processed. So if you do choose to eat oats, you need to read the label to ensure that they are gluten-free. If you do choose to go low carb, you may want to download my list of 100 low carb foods, which is a great step toward a gluten-free life. And I will leave links to the list here on the video and down below in the description area. Please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.